Well, hey there, by 11. Mr. B here again. I'm going to plunge into Chapter 16, which extends our discussion on evolution. 16.1 talks about genes and variation. There's a lot to take in, especially 16.1 and 16.2, so let's dive in. I've got the course website sitting in front of you. You can see the notes, evidence of evolution, some videos, a couple of animations. And next, we'll plunge into the notes material. I'll jump between the two as need be. Easy enough. And we'll get going with this. Genes and variation. What makes up an organism, the thing you need to be aware of, are its genes. Its genes come in various types, and we often call those genotypes. Your genes affect your physical expression, what you look like, the color of your eyes, your height, everything. And they are a major cause of the variation that we see amongst organisms on the planet. Genes are traded through sexual reproduction, and it's quite a shuffling operation. So let's get going. 16.1. When we talk about genetic variation, many genes, it's not always this simple, but take it with a grain of salt. Many genes have at least two forms, which we call alleles. So if you've got my notes blank, highlight that, alleles. Now, genetic variation is interesting because when you look at genes, they're very small differences. And you can see that in terms of things like corn, in terms of things like, common pets. And sometimes there are different versions of a gene. And the one that I like to point out the most, as far as two forms of alleles, are common things. Let's just pop out here. Like hitchhiker thumbs and straight thumbs. Great example. So now, when you look at thumbs, you either kind of have one type or another. A hitchhiker thumb, which bends way back, or a straight thumb, which goes more or less sort of straight up in the air. So here is a classic regular thumb versus hitchhiker thumb sort of analysis. The hitchhiker thumb is this one right here on the right, and it bends backwards, classic curve, and a regular thumb or a straight thumb is the one on the left. I'll just sort of move its focus here. A second picture here off YouTube has a pretty good display of it. Hitchhiker thumb on the left, in this case, straight thumb on the right. There are a lot of sort of simple alleles that you can look at. Some of the most common ones, sometimes they're a little oversimplified. We've looked at the hitchhiker thumb. We could look at eye color. And blue and brown eyes, often, it is a simplification. We have to be clear about this. Blue eyes and brown eyes are kind of an interesting combination. It is actually a little bit more complicated than this, but there's two versions of the gene for eye color. And brown is considered to be dominant. Ooh, let's make that a little smaller. While blue, which you see down here in sort of the lower corner, is considered to be recessive. Blue eyes and brown eyes. They're considered to be the same kind of gene. In the dominant form you see brown, and the recessive form you see blue. Now, depending on what the combinations are, here we see sort of a cross being done. As long as you have the capital B, or the dominant allele, your phenotype, what you see, okay, your physical expression of your genes, will be brown eyes. In two cases here, big B, little b, you will see that the parent is a carrier for a blue-eyed gene, but the only way that you would get blue eyes is if you had two little b, little b's. What does that mean? That means it's a little bit of a remote chance that you would have pure blue eyes, that you would be a purebred for blue eyes. Just like it's a remote chance, 25% chance, that you would be capital B, or purely dominant for brown eye color. Everything else is kind of a mixture. 50% of the time we're looking at a mixture. Interesting. Okay? We'll pop back for a second. So these different versions of genes that we call alleles, you can think of the thumb example that I just gave you. And it's a classic example. Blue/brown eyes. And there's more. In this year's presidential election, and I'll date this PowerPoint, there is one individual who's running for vice president, and his name is Paul Ryan. And I'll just call up a picture of him there. Paul Ryan has what we call a classically dominant hairline. Check this out. This is known, let's zoom in on it. There you go. You can see that peak down in the middle of his forehead. That's known as a widow's peak, and that's considered to be a dominant gene. Some of our nearest hominid cousins, for example gorillas, have a very strong, prominent widow's peak. Now look, this doesn't mean we're gorillas. It just means that we have some genes in common. A widow's peak is the dominant version of the straight hairline gene, which is not, there we go, which is not as prevalent. So let's go to images here. There we go. So widow's peak, let's see if we can get this a little bit better. Ha! There we go. I love this example. Widow's peak versus straight hairline. Oop, over zooming. Okay, widow's peak on the left, straight hairline on the right. Dominant versus recessive. These are just two different versions of the exact same gene. Just like blue eyes and brown eyes are considered to be alternatives of each other, there's a great number. Other ones that I love, tongue rolling. Oh, there we go. Tongue rolling genetics. Comes up pretty quick if you check YouTube. Pop on straight over to images. Some people cannot do this to save their life. They can't roll their tongue. And this is dominant. Most people can roll their tongue. But in this case, I love this. This is great. You see this girl, for example, and it's driving her crazy. She cannot roll her tongue. It gets even crazier. There are people that can crinkle their tongue like this. I absolutely cannot do that. That's another modification to a gene that allows some people to be able to crinkle their tongues. These are gene alternatives. Getting back to sort of this common example. Today, for example, we had one girl in class that could do this. She was a rarity, let's put it that way. And in class, when we did this, we had a great number of tongue rollers and very few people that couldn't. So these are alleles, alternative versions of a gene, now specifically muscles in the tongue, that enable people to do this or not to do this. It's okay, don't feel bad. There's some people that can wiggle their ears, for example, and other people that can't. And it depends which allele you got for muscles around the ear. Needless to say, ear wiggling, pretty rare. Back to our presentation. Your genetics are in fact invisible. They're really small differences in your DNA. And alleles, you got to memorize this one, folks, are alternative forms of genes. When it comes to blood types, you have A, B, O, right? You've heard of these. There can be more than just two versions of an allele. I have green eyes, and my eyes are fairly complicated. They're considered to be polyallelic, meaning that in order to make green eyes, it takes many genes on many chromosomes, quite a while to produce green eye color. And no two green eyes are really the same. By heterozygous, that means just a mixture. Hetero meaning other, and zygous, well, easiest way I can explain it to you is whether or not the mix is whether it's pure or whether it's a hybrid. A hybrid would be heterozygous, whereas a purebred would be homozygous, meaning same for traits. Here we go. Scroll up. Gene pools represent populations of organisms. Humans, we're a gene pool. And you could think of it as every human being out there being having a deck of cards, a deck of genes. And we represent all the different versions of genes that are a possibility. We're all the different alleles, right, that are present. But we're looking at a population, not individuals. So you have to consider it sort of on a macro scale. Populations are healthiest when there's the very large population, and that gives what we call a very deep gene pool. We've seen the gene pools go quite shallow. We've seen this with buffalo and bison when they were hunted to the verge of extinction, right? Shot off the backs of trains. When the population has a very thin gene pool, the members in the population may not represent enough alleles to keep the population healthy. And buffalo in particular have to be crossbred very carefully to try to introduce changes into the genes of the population. We need to strengthen their immune systems and strengthen their overall genetic depth. This next slide talks about the relative frequency of alleles, and consider it within a gene pool. Not everything is as simple as brown eyes and blue eyes, right? Consider the frequency with which an allele comes up. It's not always dominant to recessive. In fact, if we just pop this up for a second here, let's zoom in. If this is a chromosome and we're looking at these flowers, so we've got pure red flowers. Okay, so this we'll state this correctly. These are dominant genes. Red is in particular with snapdragons, which we're not looking at, but I'll use the example. Red is dominant, given a capital letter. In this case, white is dominant, given a capital letter. Well, if you think about how these combinations could come together, you don't see it all the time in the BC curriculum. I'm going to borrow this. If it's only possible that one of two alleles could be given, when you produce egg or sperm, same thing in plants, you give away one of the copies of the allele, a mommy version or a daddy version. Okay, you can only give one half of your genetics. Think of it this way. This pure red flower could either give an R or an R, and this pure white flower could only give its allele for red and white. Or sorry, rather white. I'm getting ahead of myself. If you put these combinations together, we'll write R alphabetically before W. Every single one of the children is an RW. Okay, so what does that mean? It means, in this case, that there's no recessive trait. These are co-dominant. Okay, so go out there, take some red paint, take some white paint, put them together, and you'll get pink. That's exactly what's happened with these flowers. You see it with snapdragons too. This allele for flowers is located on this spot on a particular chromosome. So when we look at, it's interesting, it says purple, but let's talk about it as being red. And this allele for the white, these are both expressing themselves to make the flower a certain color. Because they're both dominant, you're going to get pink flowers. That's called co-dominance. Here's an interesting example. Gene pool for fur color in mice. Okay, so what have we got? Well, heterozygous black. In this case, we've got a gene for black and a gene for brown. The black color, when it's produced, would mask the brown color. It doesn't matter if this mouse has a gene for the other color. It's kind of a hybrid. It's still going to appear black. And then there's your purebred black ones, okay, which will be, of course, black. It's a little bit more rare to be a purebred, so we see they're at 16%. And then there are purebred. Now, a purebred is called homozygous, as in having two of the exact same alleles, and this one's completely brown. So when we look at a population and we count up the phenotypes and we take a look out there, what we see with these mice, 48%, 16%, 64% of the mice have a black phenotype. They look dark. And okay, so let's round this off. Let's say around 60% of the time they're black and around 40% of the time they're brown. Right there in the percentages you could see which gene would be dominant, which would be what we call recessive. But I always tell my students, if critters were allowed to breed unimpeded, right? Think about dogs. There wouldn't be a high percentage of purebreds. You would have lots of hybrids, lots of gene mixing going on. And that's kind of the idea they're talking about here, a mixed gene pool. Heterozygous is considered to be a mutt, very much a mixed breed. And that's healthy for populations, mixing the genes. So what is evolution in terms of genetics? It's a change in the frequency of alleles. We see a change in the frequency of alleles, and that leads to changes in phenotypes. There's some kind of pressure, and what you've learned in chapter 15 is what that pressure is natural selection. Certain phenotypes, if you add up enough of the adaptations that they have, if they're an advantage in nature, those phenotypes and that organism will survive and reproduce, and that's the idea of fitness. Now, when organisms are being selected, when phenotypes are being selected, you have to go a little further and think, oh, indirectly, genotypes, right? The genes which made those phenotypes happen. Selection affects the genes indirectly. It's the phenotypes that are the survivability, right? That's what gets selected upon, but the genes are working in the background. They're the source. Now, how do you mix the deck of cards? How can this happen? Well, when DNA is copied, if I was copying something very complicated, every now and then I'd make an error. Now, in terms of DNA, those errors get corrected, but sometimes they don't. Can you imagine, for example, if I copied like the King James Bible, and that's a huge, voluminous work of text. Even if I was spell checking, as I went along, little mistakes would get made. Maybe this one would get corrected. Maybe as I'm copying along, I made a mistake here and I missed it. Stick to purple. Mistake here, mistake here. We have genetic machinery that checks, enzymes that check for these genetic mistakes. Some of these mistakes make it to the next generation. In grade 12 biology, when we talk about transcription and translation, which is the reading and writing of your DNA, we discuss these little mistakes and what they can do. These mistakes, called mutations, can be quite drastic. Mutations are like shuffling the DNA deck. Another way of shuffling the DNA deck is to introduce different genes from one parent to another. So mutations in sexual reproduction, they're the source of change. Some mutations are really bad. For example, melanomas If UV light shines on your skin, it can affect the DNA copying process and can actually turn on what we call oncogenes, cancer genes, and you can develop a skin cancer. So if a mutation turned out to be a beneficial thing for members of a population, it might sneak by and survive that whole natural selection process. However, if that mutation was really negative, and I'll go back to some mutation that, let's say I'm a Snow White hare and it made me a bright pink bunny in the middle of a snowy field in the middle of winter, that would probably not be good for my survival. I would get eaten in a heartbeat by a predator. Most mutations, a great percentage of them, are not good. Some are, they don't even change the organism and they're just silently building up in the genetic makeup. So, mutations you can think of as any change to the DNA sequence. And mutations can happen as a result of introduction of carcinogens. In human population, these can be poisons or chemicals that could affect your cells' replication. Right? That could be a bad thing, but mutation is also a constant source of change. They're just, as I've said before, little sort of DNA mistakes in the copying process. Maybe I oversimplified it, but that's probably good for now. Mutations don't always show up in a critter's genetic makeup. In fact, they may make such small genetic changes that they don't even appear. However, if they do show up and they affect survivability, so in a normal fruit fly, let's say there's mutations going on, no big deal, and here's a fruit fly's antenna. Looks pretty good most of the time. Okay, about like this. If we got a mutation which affected, this would be like a Hox gene mutation. Hox genes are genes which account for the production of our limbs, where our heads go, where our head goes, right? Where our legs go, arms go, etc. If we had a major mutation to some of our fundamental genes and we produced this is not good. This is not going to help with survival at all. The antenna that should be here has undergone a mutation, and what's being expressed is essentially a limb. Not too good. Okay? This does not help the population. That would probably be selected out. Gene shuffling happens mostly through sexual reproduction. And if you've ever had a chance to take a little spin through meiosis, not mitosis, that's like when you cut yourself and your skin cells repair, or the constant repair that goes into the body. We're not talking about that. We're talking about meiosis, where in humans, right, you go from 46 chromosomes down to 23 chromosomes. The essential chromosomes, there's 23 pairs, and these have undergone a little bit of shuffling. I'd love to have time right now within this lecture to talk about it, but these chromosomes are a little bit different than the ones that you grew up with. Now this variation is going on in the testes of males constantly, where sperm are getting the deck shuffling going on. And in women, well, women have eggs in multiple follicles, and each of those eggs is different. And they've already undergone the shuffling. So this shuffling would result in different genotypes, which produces different phenotypes. So while you might look like mom, right, what you're passing along has some subtle changes for eye color, hair color, skin tone, etc. And that's healthy. That's exactly how it should be. And these differences are what we say hereditable due to what's going on in your what we call your germ layers, right? That would be testes or ovaries. Very different sort of genetic complements are being produced. Single genes and multiple genes have to be kind of considered here. The flowers on the right, these are little bit simpler, right? What we're looking at, if I can ever get this to pop up, very nice. These are simple genes, either red or white, okay? The genes, or alternative forms, alleles, are very predictable. It's not always that simple. I have green eyes, and that involves multiple genes to make green eye color. Height is another one. It involves many genes, like green eyes, to produce a given trait, that being height. Now, there are some predictors. You could say, well, Dad was tall, so I'm tall. However, it's not always so. I've got cousins that are quite tall, and I'm really not. Many genes are required to produce height. So what we've got here are the world's tallest man, well in excess of 8 feet, and the world's shortest man. And this comes down to the gene for a human growth hormone. How much of it is produced? It's a hormone that, when produced, takes nutrition into cells, like the ends of your bones, the cartilaginous ends of your bones, and either causes your bones to grow tremendously, or in the case of our little person here, not grow enough. So mutations to that gene, you may get gigantism, okay, extreme height, or you may get dwarfism, which is what you see here. It's not as simple as blue eyes, brown eyes, for example. You may have many genes required to produce traits. Height, definitely like that. Single gene traits, I guess if we wanted to use a simple term, we could say monoallelic. They're a little bit easier to predict, right? Widow's peak, straight hairline, pretty easy. There's only 2 possible phenotypes, and what we see here, you either have the widow's peak or you do not. And based on frequency, that's a fancy word which means how often it shows up. This graph isn't entirely perfect, but if we go straight over, we're hitting about the 70% mark, and here we're hitting about the 25% mark. In 16.2, boy, do those numbers ever come up. 3/4 of the time, you see a dominant trait with single gene traits, and 25% of the time, or around that, you see the recessive trait being expressed. And not to give away the game too much, but if you think about it, think about brown eye color. These were the genotypes for brown eye color, and there was only one time you could get blue eyes. 3 out of 4 are brown phenotypes, and 1 out of 4, 25% of the time, you can get the recessive or homozygous recessive phenotype. It comes right down to numbers. It's very predictable, but in genetics, this doesn't come up all that often. It's not quite that simple. And if you love genetics, man, will you love statistics. Moving on. As we say, many traits are controlled by multiple genes. So my wonderful green eyes, geez, thanks, Mom. Here's my best drawing of an eye. Check it out. My lovely, hey, don't do that. Let's hit done. My lovely green eye color is a result of my iris expressing green color, and that's got a lot of inputs. Okay, it's a polygenic trait, no doubt about it. And eye color is very complicated. That's why we say you can't just break it down to one thing. It comes down to melanin. Blue eyes, they don't have as much melanin, that dark sort of protein you find in your skin, where blue eyes, well, heck, or rather, blue eyes don't have very much. I'll be clear. Blue eyes have very little, and brown eyes have a lot. So when you look at races, and I hate to use the term race, but when you look at humans that have a lot of melanin in their skin, when you look at the coloration, you'll see that a lot of melanin being expressed in the body Well, if there's a lot being expressed in the body, there can be a lot expressed in eye color too. And in some populations, you don't really see a lot of blue eye color. Well, it has a lot to do with just overall melanin production in the body. But folks, it's important to understand that there's always a range of characteristics. It's kind of like a lot like letter grades. So when you look at a range of characteristics, let's choose, I don't know, how about an annoying red? In a population, you could expect, now remember this is frequency, or how many times you're seeing something show up. There's not that many short people. I mean, there's some, but they make up sort of the minority. And the tall freaks, and we mean that in the nicest way possible, right, are really tall people. Yeah, you don't see a lot of them. But what you do see in between is kind of what we call the average. And I like to say it takes all types. These types on the ends are not as frequent as what you see in the middle. In school, you see this too. You see some people just don't make the grade. Some people do pretty good. They're kind of in the middle, you know, C+, coming up on the Bs. And there's some people that are just hitting like 99% all the time. And we would say they're on this side of the curve. Now, when you look at traits, polygenic traits, for height, this describes height extremely well. And in populations, you should see a range. That's pretty common. When this graph starts to change and the range isn't what you expected, if you didn't see this nice sort of tall mountain with an average in the middle, then that's an indication something's going on in the population. Okay, so this is Mr. B. I've gone over 16.1. I'm going to turn off mirroring. There we go. If you get a chance, it is pretty important to go through a good number of things on the course site. And we've got some great stuff for evidence of evolution, vestigial organs, the evolution of hominids. I think I've already shown the coelacanth, the mud skipper, just little tidbits about natural selection. Okay, thanks for listening, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. B out.